All right, our guest speaker for this February's General Committee meeting is Daniel Jaffee, who is an environmental and rural sociologist and Associate Professor of Sociology at Portland State University. He received his Ph.D. in 2006 from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and SSAFE member Judy Hines from Kendall at Longwood noticed Daniel was mentioned in the Oberlin Alumni Magazine, Class of '87, as having just published a book about bottled water and referred him to me as a potential guest speaker for SAFE. Many, many thanks to Judy. His first book, Brewing Justice, Fair Trade Coffee, Sustainability, and Survival, received the Wright Mills Book Award. His latest book, Unbottled, The Fight Against Plastic Water and for Water Justice, explores bottled water's impact on social justice and sustainability and how movements are fighting back. Please make sure you are muted for his talk and join me in welcoming Daniel Jaffee. All right, Daniel, I am going to spotlight you and you are free to.
Thank you. Thank you, Michelle, for the lovely introduction and just for the invitation to talk to the group. It's a real pleasure, and I'm thrilled to see so many people here. And I love the Oberlin connection. That's great. So I'll try to jump right into it. I understand that the group is interested in addressing and eliminating single-use plastics at an institutional level, and that's just an incredibly admirable goal. And I really do think that institutional purchasing is kind of a critical frontier in these efforts. So I will try to speak to the bottled water, single-use plastic bottled water aspect of this, which is what I know best. And then hope, if other questions come up, we can sort of address them in the Q&A. So let me just jump right in then. The meteoric rise of the appearance and the meteoric rise of bottled water and its sort of normalization across society within my lifetime, as well as I'm sure all of yours, going from essentially nothing late 1970s to this is a graph. The dark black line shows the rise of bottled water consumption as sort of gallons per capita, gallons per person per year. And except for a couple of years dip during the Great Recession of, 08, 09, it's sort of been this inexorable rise up to 47 gallons per capita 2021. And you can see that some of that rise has come at the expense of sodas fall. Light gray line is soft drink consumption. And it's important to keep in mind, the bottled water industry sort of vociferously argues that growth is not coming at the expense of the tap, that it's not in competition with tap water, it's in competition with soda and beverages. And so, one of the things I do is look at that claim and sort of come back to this. But you can see here, it's surpassed soda, and on a global level, bottled and packaged water is far and away the most consumed packaged beverage. It leaves the others in the dust. Right, this is 455 billion liters in 2021. It's about 120 billion gallons. So you can think about this in terms of it is the single largest contributor by far to the global plastic waste disaster, crisis. The words are strong words are justified, and it's about 34% of the problem. So just sort of keep that in mind, and both at a U.S. and a global level. I'll share just a couple of statistics. I mean, how big a market are we talking about now? This is a $300 billion global market. And I say bottled and packaged water, of course, because it captures the range of different forms that private commodified drinking water comes in, from multi-gallon jugs to plastic bags and sachets in some parts of the world, et cetera. But it's the same industry, and it's projected to pass $500 billion by the end of the decade. So it's no small potatoes. In the US, we're getting close to $50 billion in sales. China growing fast, a quarter of global consumption. The US and Mexico is another quarter. And it's important to note that about 70% of bottled and packaged water is those individual single-serving plastic bottles worldwide. And it's been acknowledged as just a monumental environmental problem. The Guardian called it as dangerous as climate change. And you're all aware of the marine plastic problem. And it's worth noting that studies have found that beverage bottles and their caps together are the single largest marine garbage item. And by one study, they account for over 50% of all marine waste. And remember, the bottled water, packaged water, is the single largest pie slice of that. So it is really quite significant. And the irony is that in many places, and certainly in the US, most of that bottled water is essentially tap water. It is taken from municipal sources, already treated municipal water supplies, and further filtered. Sometimes they strip out the mineral content and add their own proprietary mineral mixes like Dasani or Aquafina, Pure Life. This chart shows that, almost 2/3 of bottled water in the US is municipal water already treated. And I've tried to sort of structure this a little bit around some talking points, one could potentially use with an administration. One's trying to persuade to eliminate this, at least this facet of single-use plastics, right? So environmental impact being one. Certainly an enormous ecological footprint for this product. Studies have found that the energy footprint of bottled water is something like 2,000 times that of the equivalent volume of tap water. A more recent study finds it's close, it might be as high as 3,500 times greater in terms of sort of a range of environmental impacts. Quite significant. The second item is the question of safety. And certainly we all know that the bottled water industry has grown in part by marketing that cast doubt on the quality or the safety of public tap water. And we all grew up drinking only tap water. And yet, it sort of as bottled water has become so normalized. And one of the tacit claims, I think, is the implication that it is somehow safer or more reliable than bottled water. That turns out to be quite ironic, given that the regulatory framework is actually much more rigorous for tap water, certainly in the US and other industrialized nations. Tap water utilities have to do far more testing. They're far more scrutinized. They're regulated by the EPA. Consumers are required to be notified when contamination or other problems are found. Whereas bottled water is regulated by the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, a far weaker regulatory regime. Companies do their own safety testing. Enforcement is thin. Consumer Reports did a whole series of articles on this if you're interested, looking into the regulatory issues. And overall, it's really an uneven playing field, and consumers are far less likely to find out if their bottled water was contaminated or recalled. So overall, it's possible to say that bottled water is no safer overall, and does actually contain higher levels of certain very problematic substances. And if you were reading the news about a month ago, you saw this slew of headlines about microplastics and nanoplastics being found in bottled water. So scientists had already established that bottled water contained, significantly higher levels of microplastics, something like 22-to-1 ratio compared to tap water. But these new findings kind of blew them out of the water. They said this was hundreds, if not thousands of times more particles than they had expected to find in bottled water. And the health implications are not entirely understood, but certainly health and safety is an issue that one can talk about. They do contain far higher levels of plastic fragments. There is also the leaching issue to be aware of. The PET plastic bottles on the left here, the typical ones, under conditions of high heat, long storage, have been documented to leach substances like phthalates, antimony, other estrogenic hormone-mimicking chemicals. But these jugs on the right, the carbonate jugs, the hard plastic jugs that go in water coolers, they are even more of a concern. And you might be aware that many of them sort of leach the substance BPA, the notorious endocrine disrupting chemical BPA. And then more recently, a lot of jugs have come out saying that they are BPA free, but scientific research has shown that even the replacement plastics still contain other estrogenic chemicals. So the carbonate jugs are of particular concern. Then there's the cost issue. I think this is a really important one when talking to an administration. I suspect that for many administrations in institutional purchasing, it might be somewhat invisible for them. I would imagine they would sort of lump it into, food purchasing budgets or that sort of thing. But I think it really is worth highlighting the dramatically higher cost of acquiring bottled water versus tap water. I won't spend too much time with this. This is a table that I have in the book, but I sort of decided to compare for different brands and different packages the cost of meeting the annual average consumption of bottled water, 47 gallons per person. And then in the yellow bar, on the right-hand yellow bar, was the cost of meeting that 47 gallons for a family of four. And it ranges from something in the $300 to $400 a year to close to $3,000 a year. Whereas the same volume of tap water, public tap water for four people, was less than $1, 94 cents. And that's hundreds of thousands of times more expensive. And I suspect that your institutional purchasing budgets do contain this, and eliminating this has proven to be generate major cost savings for local governments. And there's no reason why it wouldn't do the same at the institutional level. Also, bottled water's rise sort of dovetails with other phenomena like the disappearance or the deterioration of public water fountains, public drinking water infrastructure, the underfunding. Really, we have a 45-year-long problem of federal underfunding and disinvestment in our public water infrastructures. The federal government has effectively almost gotten out of the business of funding local water infrastructure, and cities and states have had to pick up the tab, and that's why water bills and sewer bills have risen so fast around the country. It's a product of the federal government pulling back, and in certain localities where tax bases are low, you start to see, some of these problems cropping up, deterioration, and that drives the bottled water market. And certainly the bottled water industries, perhaps their one valid argument is that it is in many places simply too difficult to find access to tap water in public places. Like, here's an airport. I took a picture of this out of service. And finally, just in terms of establishing the sort of the evidence, tap water consumption is also definitely falling around the U.S. This bar chart is a little confusing, but the light blue bars show the rise or the fall of tap water consumption each year since the beginning of the millennium. And the dark blue bars show the same changes in bottled water consumption. And you can see bottled water grew every year except for 2 years during the Great Recession. But tap water has fallen most years except for a few. So, the industry's argument that it's not competing with tap water just it is not supported by the evidence. So bottled water's gain is partly comes at the loss of soda consumption, but also partly we're drinking less tap water. Okay, so let me pivot now and talk briefly just sort of about the pushback or the backlash, the responses, which I sort of lump together in that phrase, kind of the reclaiming the tap facet of the movement. And I just find this so, honestly, doing the research for this book over the last several years, this was the element that gave me the most hope and surprised me the most. The sort of momentum and sort of fervor of this kind of constellation of activities that are happening, from local community refilling efforts and schemes to private businesses offering free tap water on their premises, to cities building out water fountain networks. Cities are finally starting to replace the dilapidated or disappeared fountains with these nice, shiny new, they have to be attractive, right? Clean, and they have to have these bottle refilling elements here. And here's one in Australia, but and they talk about refilling and reuse, and this is really catching on. I think it is catching fire essentially. These, you were all talking about your refillable bottles. 60% of US households now own these refillable bottles, and people are beginning to really demand en masse points to refill those bottles at in public space. And cities and states and localities are starting to satisfy those demands. And we're really seeing sort of networks of free refilling points cropping up. And some of it is cities building out public fountain networks, but some of it is private businesses or public or nonprofit institutions offering free water on their premises and linking them together with these sort of networks with window stickers. Here's one in New Zealand at the bottom, where you can walk into that coffee shop. You don't have to buy a cup of coffee, and you can fill your bottle right there for free. It gains them goodwill. And then it's sort of, I think, one of the critical sort of developments was that a lot of this is coming together through organizations and even smartphone apps, and I'm not a big app person, but I did download the Refill app because it started with an organization in the UK, and now it has gone global. And they, if you turn on your location, they'll tell you where the nearest free refill point is, and they've got 300,000 refill points around the world. It's really spreading, and so this is really taking off. And I just feel like this is way more than the sum of its parts, and it's impossible to sort of grasp the totality of it, but it includes municipal policy. Cities are passing bans on governments purchasing of bottled water, selling of plastic bottled water in public property like parks, City Hall, airports. San Francisco Airport, LAX have banned plastic bottled water entirely. If you got caught unawares, you can buy a reusable bottle and you can fill it at these refill points. And I just want to point out the infrastructure is really diverse for meeting these needs. It's all sort of situationally dependent. And then on the left, for folks who have local concerns around water quality or water safety, because I know that some many communities in the US have localized issues with lead or heavy metals, where it's not the municipal system as a whole, but it's an individual building, or it's the internal piping that raises concerns. My building at Portland State University had a lead problem. And I just want to point out that these lead removing filters or heavy metal removing filters that are inside these hydration stations render that not a significant concern. And so you can install these devices in places with localized problematic issues. And the Detroit Public Schools is the great example. They did this in every single school. They did it in hundreds of schools, and they only spent $3 million to put them in, like, I don't know, so how many hundreds of schools. So just to suggest the different kinds of infrastructural solutions. And then finally, these efforts are sort of starting to come together in networks, communities that have passed legislation, and also nonprofit organizations. And the Blue Communities movement, I talk about it in the chapter, is one of the important ones. It started in Canada, but it's gone sort of more international now. And they've got something like 80 municipalities, but also nonprofit organizations and school districts and universities that have passed resolutions. And the crucial one here is number 2, the ban or phase out the sale of bottled water in municipal facilities and municipal events. And on their website, they have a long list of the Blue communities, as well as some links. And so I could imagine Kendall or your entire organization potentially being the next Blue community. And so there are some support infrastructures for doing that, templates, etc. In the book, I also try to list or get a handle on how many communities are the biggest communities, biggest cities around the world that have passed these policies, from banning bottled water, prohibiting its sale on city property, being part of the Blue Communities Initiative from New York to LA to Berlin to Delhi, Toronto, Paris, etc. And I calculated that in total around the world, about a little over 200 million people are currently living in cities, states, provinces, etc., that have passed these bans. So it's not insignificant. And it is really growing. And finally, campuses, university. I know many of you are connected to universities. Campuses have been a hotspot for this activity since really the turn of the century. Here's a map of campus bottled water bans. That's an old map. But more recently, I think these efforts are sort of fusing with really the movement to stop single-use plastics. And so we're starting to see things like the entire California State University system. I don't know how many dozens of campuses they have banned all single-use plastics, including bottled water, just last year. So that's institutional purchasing on an enormous scale. And it really is happening, and it can happen. And the industry is starting to wake up to the impact of these efforts. I quote this Nestle Waters representative in the book: "The water bottle has in some ways become the mink coat or the pack of cigarettes. It's socially not very acceptable to the young folks, and that scares me." Some market reports on the industry recent months talk about how really speak with alarm about the impact of the refilling movement on sales. And so I'm going to begin to wrap up here just by updating that graph that I showed you right at the start. With the blue line is the bottled water consumption, and the red line is soda. But if you look right at the end here, I've added on one more year, 2022, and I'll blow it up here so it's easy to see. For the first time since the Great Recession, bottled water consumption and sales have fallen. It's only the third year in history in the US that this has happened, and it's the only year it's ever happened not during a recession. And the industry is well aware, and it's quite well recognized, that at least a significant part of that drop has to do with this movement back to the tap. And so I think it's sailing with a real tailwind. It is a growing movement. It's burgeoning, and I applaud you for sort of visualizing yourselves as part of these efforts. And then just to close, I've offered sort of a list of 4 or 5 organizations that are doing work supporting campaigns around these issues, around single-use plastics, around bottled water bans, et cetera, pushing for refillables. And that's really all I have to say. So, I want to thank you for your time, and I'm happy to, chat now, have a discussion, answer questions, whatever you'd like.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Daniel. I'm going to, oh, good. You removed it. All right. Well, I have some questions actually already sent in from our SAFE members who have read the chapter 4. And I have one in the chat that I thought maybe we would start with. And that is from Ted Woolner in Oberlin. A commission is taking 2 years to create international protocols to govern plastic production, reduction, and recycling, including bottled water. Is it enforceable? Countries like India are absolutely dependent on bottled water. How can 1.3 billion Indians shift away from single-use bottles without clean municipal water? And there's also something about polluted wells.
It's absolutely crucial. I mean, this is the central objection or problem. And a large part of the book I do address, not only in developing nations, but also in communities in the US. There's structurally disadvantaged. Many communities of color and low-income communities have some of the same problems around water quality and tap water contamination, groundwater contamination. And so have to really wrestle and wrangle with that. And I guess what I would say is, at one level, we have to argue for a restoration of the certainly looking at the US, a restoration of the public role in investing and maintaining and bringing back up to snuff our precious public water infrastructure that we have all paid with, and our parents paid with for decades and centuries with their tax dollars and their ratepayer dollars, right? Make that once again reliably trustworthy so that everyone can turn on the tap with confidence. Now, on a global level, it is absolutely true, right? There are many parts of the world where dependence on packaged water is not optional. Hundreds of millions, if not billions, of people are at the moment dependent on the packaged water industry. And this is where you get into the industry sort of saying it is the solution to the water crises around the world. But I think that we have to be very concerned about the future that is leading us to, so recognize the situation as it exists, but understand that the United Nations declared a human right to water and sanitation in 2010. And I think we have to acknowledge that when a substance essential for human life is provided partly or entirely by the private sector or through the market, that access to it is going to be premised on the ability to pay. And that means that some percentage of the population is invariably going to go without. And in the case of drinking water, that of course is deadly. And so I think we can't accept a future where portions of the world and portions of the US population are sort of consigned long term to live kind of in a costly bottled water world. And I think, it requires sort of pushing for solutions that allow for systems where the public sector or where their communities themselves can once again provide drinking water and water in general to populations on a non-for-profit basis. And that is a big, tall order. But I think a vision of a just settlement, a just arrangement has got to include that, because as climate change hits more and more and water scarcity becomes more and more acute, the temptation to lock up these sources for profit increases. And I think that we will never have a true satisfaction of the human right to water entirely through the market.
Okay. Mary, did you want to ask the questions that you submitted?
I'd rather ask another one.
Okay.
This is so unnerving. Many years ago, a friend of mine asked me to just meet once with his financial man, who he thought just was a miracle worker. And I remember distinctly this man saying, and of course, I always invest in water, which of course is exactly the problem. Those of us that are in the markets, are there any particular companies, stocks that we should be certain we don't own?
That's a great question. And the financialization of water is moving and changing so quickly that it's really hard to get a handle on it. It's an area I know a little bit about, but not a lot. There are water futures markets now. There are complete private water markets in some countries like Australia. And Chile have gone fully private, which raises, major questions. But all I know is that private equity firms and some hedge funds have started to get seriously into water, and it's a real concern. And I think it's a bigger problem than I've been able to wrap my head around. But being aware, just like land grabs, water grabs are sort of a really concerning development, and profiting off of scarcity, I think, has direct environmental implications, but also human rights implications. So that's the best I can say.
Thanks.
Okay. All right. Well, we only have a minute or two. Mary, you'd submitted some pretty in-depth questions.
Please see if somebody else have questions, Michelle.
Okay. Well, I did have one submitted. How do you feel about boxed water as a substitute for plastic bottles?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, right? I think, right, so the bottled water companies are still pretty wedded to single-use plastic as their dominant model. They're still not willing to go beyond it. In some places, they're being forced to include higher percentages of recycled plastic in their products, like in California and in the European Union, and to do a bit more recycling. They've really, really resisted and dragged their feet. But it's hard for them to move away from plastics. The box water, it solves maybe one issue, the plastic issue, but leaves untouched the environmental impact of producing and distributing bottled water, but it also leaves intact the privatization question or the commodification question. So I prefer to see us in places where we have access to, a century more investments in public water systems, to turn back to our public water systems, make them reliably safe, and install technologies that allow us to drink tap water whenever possible. And actually, institutions, fixed places like independent living communities are just so ideal, because you've got a bounded physical space and a single institutional management. So things become possible, that might not in other spaces. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Let's take maybe one more from Larry in Hanover. You're muted, Larry.
Just one word, I guess. The word is glass. Can you talk a little bit about how practical, impractical, what the role might be of glass, at least in some cases.
Yeah, you know, I was operating under the impression that glass was kind of a better model, you know, going back to glass in refillables, right? The returnables of going back to the before the no deposit, no return era. Interestingly, it turns out that glass has some significant environmental footprint to it. I don't know all the details, but it surprised me to see how high that was. But there are groups pushing for a return to refillables, back to the deposit era. There's a group called Story of Stuff Project that I put in the slides that has a campaign right now to get Coke and Pepsi to go back to returnables. And there's a group called Oceana, an oceans group that's pushing similarly. And what they're actually promoting is durable plastic refillables, which, you know, I don't know what the microplastics side of that is, but they claim that if you return to deposit system and these durable plastics, which are lighter, you would save 50% in greenhouse gas emissions and 40% in waste. Now, that's still far more environmental impact than the impact of simply providing public tap water. So that's important to be aware. But there is an argument that people are making for certainly for other beverages besides water to return to a refillable deposit-based model. Yeah, I think it's important.
Yeah, I would just mention that the current National Geographic has a whole issue, or at least features new models of glass-based, new forms that glass is being experimented with. And one wonders anyway that possibly there's an avenue there. But anyway, that's.
Thanks. That's a really great point.
Daniel, I just have to tell you that we have one safe community, the Admiral in Chicago, which has completely banned bottled water. So if any of the rest of you have, please speak up. But the Admiral is out ahead, I think.
Wonderful to hear. I'm really excited about the possibilities, and I'd love to hear how things evolve in your sites.
Absolutely amazing presentation, Daniel. And I'm so thrilled that how you were able to shape it around our communities and talk about information to help convince administrations and the options such as those filtered refill stations. I think what a good solution on a community-wide scale. Wouldn't we like to see that instead?
Yeah, well, thank you. And it's a real privilege to talk to you all, and I've enjoyed it a lot.
All right. Thank you so much, Daniel. We're going to have to move on to the next part of our meeting, but I'm sure you'll hear from us. I'll try to let you know our progress as we move ahead.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Take care.